It began with a copper coin found lodged in the mortar of a basement wall in Lower Manhattan, 3 stories below the modern street level. It did not belong there. It did not carry the profile of a president or the heraldry of a recognized king. Instead, it bore a griffin, wings spread in a posture of aggressive defiance, and a script that defied the standard numismatic catalogues of the 19th century. The metal was too pure for the era's local minting capabilities, the strike too precise for a colonial counterfeit. Ask yourself why a currency of such clear sophistication would be buried in the foundation of a building meant to last for centuries. Not a mistake, not a hoard, a burial. This single piece of stamped metal was the first crack in a very large, very deliberate wall of silence. I held it in my hand and felt the weight of a history that had been physically erased, scraped from the ledger of human memory by the very institutions that claim to protect it. We are told the past is a solid road leading to the present. What if it is a minefield of intentional gaps? The record of 1844 is a curious thing, a year of sudden silences and frantic administrative overhauls. We see the birth of the modern central banking systems, the hardening of borders, and the standardization of global trade. But look closer at the ledgers. Between the lines of the Bank of England's charters and the reorganization of the American Treasury, there is a phantom deficit, a massive withdrawal of liquidity that seems to have no origin and no destination. It was the year the world's most pervasive medium of exchange was declared invalid overnight. Not for inflation, not for war, for existence. The currency of Tartaria did not simply lose its value. It was stripped of its status as an object of reality. To hold it became a crime. To trade it became a heresy. Imagine the chaos of a global economy where the gold in your pocket is suddenly rebranded as lead by executive fiat. This was the great erasure, the moment the transition from an organic, resource-backed past to a controlled institutional future was finalized with the stroke of a pen. I spent months in the sub-basements of the New York Public Library, navigating the smell of decaying paper and the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. I was looking for the notices. If you want to disappear as civilization, you start with its money. I found a single microfilm scan of a broadside from a defunct Philadelphia daily dated November the 12th, 1844. It was a directive from an unnamed clearinghouse ordering the immediate surrender of all coinage bearing the Northern Crest. No explanation was given. No exchange rate was offered. It was a command for total liquidation. Not a recall, not a reminting, an obliteration. Why would a government demand the destruction of wealth during an economic expansion? Unless that wealth represented a lineage they could no longer control. Unless those coins were the last remaining physical proof of a sovereign power that spanned the steppes to the Sierras, a power that the burgeoning industrial empires needed to bury before they could claim the land as empty and discovered. Look at the architecture of our oldest banks. Consider the load distribution of the massive granite columns and the subterranean vaults that seem over-engineered for the mere storage of paper notes. These are not just buildings, they are anchors. They were built atop the ruins of the old world's administrative hubs, literal capstones placed over the nervous centers of a previous global network. When the currency was declared invalid, the physical infrastructure of that economy had to be repurposed. We see it in the great fires that swept through Chicago, Boston, and San Francisco in the mid to late 19th century. In every instance, the municipal records and the local mints were the first to burn. The fire didn't just destroy wood and brick. It sanitized the paper trail. It turned the old currency into slag and the old deeds into ash. What if the smoke of the 19th century was the incense of a global funeral? Ask yourself why every major city in the Western world required a total renaissance between 1850 and 1900. The institutional gatekeeping is most evident in the way we are taught to perceive geography. We are shown maps with vast, empty spaces, the wild frontiers, the uninhabited wastes. But the old currency tells a different story. It was found in the hands of merchants in the Levant, in the pockets of fur trappers in the Rockies, and in the foundation deposits of temples in Southeast Asia. It was a truly global liquidity. The griffin was everywhere. It represented a system of trade that didn't rely on the debt-based models of the Rothschilds or the centralizing grip of the monarchies. It was a decentralized gold standard that functioned on a scale we are told was impossible for that time. By invalidating the coin, they invalidated the connection. They broke the world into pieces so they could sell it back to us bit by bit. Not a progression of civilization, not a triumph of democracy. A hostile takeover of the planet's legacy. Consider the rhythmic nature of the archival gaps. Every 75 years, there is a systemic cleaning of the historical record. The veterans of the previous era pass away. The primary documents are moved to off-site storage that eventually suffers an accidental flood or fire, and the textbooks are rewritten to emphasize a simpler, more linear narrative. But the metal survives. In the mud-larking pits of the Thames and the construction sites of the Moscow metro, the invalidated currency continues to surface. These are the out-of-place artifacts that the academic establishment dismisses as curiosities or frauds. They are not frauds. They are the evidence of a breach of contract between the rulers and the ruled. The transition to the modern era was not a natural evolution. It was a violent pivot away from a high-functioning global past toward a controlled, scarcity-driven present. I met a man in an underground archive in Zurich who had spent 40 years tracking the flow of ghost gold, bullion that appears in national reserves without a traceable mining origin. He showed me a ledger from 1845, a private account of a Swiss firm that specialized in melting down foreign coinages. The volume was staggering. Tons of high-purity gold, all arriving in crates marked with symbols that didn't correspond to any known nation of the time. This was the wealth of Tartaria being laundered into the foundations of the modern financial world. It is the secret backing of the US dollar and the British pound. Our modern prosperity is built on the recycled bones of a giant we were told never existed. The currency wasn't worthless. It was too valuable to be left in the hands of the people. It had to be confiscated, renamed, and redistributed through the filter of the central banks. What if the Dark Ages aren't a period in the distant past, but a recurring tool of governance? By declaring the currency invalid, the architects of the 1840s created an artificial dark age for the preceding culture. They cut the financial hamstrings of every family and city that operated under the old system. Poverty was used as a weapon to force compliance with the new industrial order. If you could no longer buy bread with the coin of your grandfathers, you were forced to labour for the script of the new factories. It was the ultimate enclosure movement, moving from the fields to the very concept of value itself. Not this freedom, not that progress, something else entirely, a total enclosure of the human future. They didn't just steal the land, they stole the means of remembering that the land was once part of something much greater. Ask yourself why the griffin is so often relegated to the realm of mythology. In heraldry, it is a guardian of treasure. In the currency of Tartaria, it was the sovereign seal. By turning the symbol into a fairy tale, they ensure that when a child sees it on an old coin or a crumbling frieze, they think of dragons and magic rather than a sophisticated global empire. It is a masterful form of psychological erasure. We are surrounded by the ruins of a high technology civilization, but we have been trained to see them as neoclassical or Gothic revivals. We see the coins and call them tokens. We see the maps and call them speculative. The evidence is hidden in plain sight, protected by the sheer audacity of the lie. The currency was declared invalid because it was the physical manifestation of a truth that could not be allowed to stand. Now we stand at the precipice of a new invalidation. As we move toward digital currencies and the total tracking of every transaction, the final echoes of the old world's freedom are being silenced. The gold is gone, the coins are in the melting pot, and the records are digital ghosts that can be deleted with a single command. The mystery of the 1844 invalidation is not just a historical footnote, it is a template for what is happening now. We are the inheritors of a ghost empire, living in the hollowed out shells of its cities, spending the diluted remnants of its wealth. The question is no longer whether Tartaria existed. The question is what happens to a civilization when it forgets how to recognize its own heritage. If they could invalidate the world in 1844, what are they preparing to invalidate today? We are left with the silence of the archives and the weight of a single copper coin. Beyond the vault doors of the modern central banks lies a geography of exclusion, a map where the borders are drawn in ink that only the initiated can read. We are told the transition to the gold standard was a triumph of Victorian reason, a stabilization of a chaotic global market. What if it was actually a blockade? In the years following 1844, the maritime logs of the East India companies show a peculiar pattern of interception. They weren't hunting pirates, they were hunting bullion. Any vessel carrying the stamped coinage of the Central Scythian Authority, the term used in classified diplomatic cables, was boarded, its cargo seized, and its crew re-educated or silenced. Not a customs dispute, not a trade war. A systemic decapitation of a rival financial reality. By cutting off the physical flow of the griffin-stamped currency, the burgeoning Atlantic powers effectively cordoned off an entire hemisphere from the global conversation. They didn't just stop the money, they stopped the movement of ideas, people, and sovereignty that the money represented. Consider the phenomenon of the mud flood architecture found in every major colonial capital from Melbourne to Vancouver. We see windows half buried in the earth, grand entrances that have been converted into second-story balconies, and subterranean levels of exquisite masonry that serve no modern architectural purpose. The official narrative suggests these are merely light wells or the result of fluctuating street grades during rapid urbanization. Ask yourself, why would a supposedly primitive frontier society waste millions of man-hours burying the most ornate portions of their buildings? They wouldn't. These structures were not built by the pioneers they were inherited. They are the civic infrastructure of the Tartarian network, repurposed after the 1844 invalidation rendered their original owners insolvent. When the currency died, the titles to these lands and buildings defaulted to the new central registries. The pioneers didn't build the cities, they moved into the ruins and shoveled the dirt over the evidence of the previous occupants. The load distribution of these inherited buildings suggests a technology of stone cutting that exceeds the capabilities of the steam-powered era. Look at the joints. Look at the precision of the acoustic properties in the grand halls. These were not mere places of business. They were energy nodes designed to resonate with a specific frequency that the old currency, composed of a specific high purity electrum, was tuned to interact with. Not magic, not mysticism. A sophisticated, lost branch of resonance-based economics. When the new, impure alloys of the mid-19th century were introduced, the harmonic balance was broken. The buildings became dead stone, and the currency became inert metal. The institutional gatekeepers knew exactly what they were doing. They replaced a living, vibrational system of value with a static, debt-based system of control. They turned a cathedral of commerce into a prison of interest. I tracked a series of lost ledgers to an estate sale in rural Bavaria belonging to a family whose ancestors were high-ranking clerks in the Habsburg administration. Among the yellowed parchment was a list of prohibited metallurgical signatures. It wasn't about the weight of the gold or the purity of the silver. It was about the trace elements, iridium, osmium, and other rare earth metals found in the Tartarian coins that allowed them to be authenticated instantly by simple touch or sound. This was smart money before the digital age. It carried a physical watermark that could not be forged by the crude mints of London or Paris. To maintain their monopoly, the new powers had to declare these superior metals contaminated or unstable. They forced the world to accept a lower quality product because they couldn't replicate the high quality one. Not progress, not evolution, a deliberate degradation of human material culture. The erasure trope is most powerful when it is applied to the very names of places. After 1844, the gazetteers of the world underwent a radical revision. Tartary, once a sprawling designation on every map from the 17th and 18th centuries, suddenly fragmented into a dozen smaller ethnic territories. The unified administrative structure vanished from the textbooks. It was replaced by a narrative of wandering nomads and primitive tribes. But nomads do not strike high purity electrum coins. Primitive tribes do not build star forts with mathematically perfect lines of fire and integrated drainage systems. The coins prove the existence of the administration. The administration proves the existence of the state. Therefore, the coins had to be unmade. If you can control the medium of exchange, you can control the medium of history. What if the Industrial Revolution was actually a massive salvage operation of Tartarian technology, funded by the stolen bullion of the 1844 confiscations? Ask yourself why the 1851 Great Exhibition in London was housed in a crystal palace that looked more like a greenhouse for giants than a convention centre for merchants. These exhibitions and world's fairs were the clearinghouses for the Great Erasure. They were temporary cities built around existing Tartarian structures. Tartarian used to showcase newly invented technologies that were actually recovered artifacts. At the end of each fair, the buildings were almost always demolished or burned. Why? If you have created a masterpiece of glass and steel, why tear it down within 6 months? Unless the building itself was a piece of evidence that didn't fit the new timeline, unless the architecture revealed a level of sophistication that made the Victorian inventors look like children playing with blocks. The fairs were the final liquidation sales of a bankrupt civilization, where the stolen assets of the Griffin were rebranded under the names of the new elite. The rhythm of the institutional takeover is documented in the sudden rise of compulsory education in the late 1800s. It was the first generation of children who were systematically taught that the maps of their grandfathers were fanciful and that the old coins found in the fields were Roman or Viking or unknown. By controlling the classroom, the gatekeepers ensured that the physical evidence would no longer have a conceptual home. A coin is only a piece of metal if you have been taught to forget the kingdom it represents. This is the ultimate form of erasure, not the destruction of the object, but the destruction of the meaning. The 1844 invalidation was the catalyst. It created a world of orphaned artifacts, objects that sit in museum basements because their existence contradicts the authorized version of human development. They are the unresolved loops of our material reality. In the archives of the Vatican, there are whispered rumors of a linguistic quarantine that accompanied the currency invalidation. It wasn't just the money that was changed, it was the vocabulary of value. Words that described the Tartarian social contract, concepts of communal equity and resonance-based labour were excised from the legal dictionaries. They were replaced by the cold adversarial language of contract law and human resources. We lost the ability to even describe the world that was taken from us. We are living in a linguistic cage, built from the bars of the very laws that declared our true inheritance invalid. Not a misunderstanding, not a natural shift in language, a calculated linguistic strike designed to make the past unthinkable. What if the Tower of Babel wasn't a myth of the ancient past, but a description of what happened in the 19th century? I find myself walking the streets of modern cities, looking at the historic plaques with a newfound skepticism. Every time I see a date like 1845 or 1848 on a foundation stone, I see a tombstone. I see a marker for the year the old world was finally buried and the new, sanitized history was inaugurated. The tension is everywhere if you know how to look for it. It's in the way the old stone of a post office doesn't quite match the new brick of the addition. It's in the way the heritage districts are always the most heavily policed. They are guarding the crime scene. They are ensuring that no one digs too deep or asks too many questions about the invalid foundations of our economy. The 1844 decree never ended. It just became the invisible background radiation of our lives. The investigative essayist does not look for the smoking gun. They look for the absence of the gun. They look for the silhouette left behind by the thing that was removed. The invalidation of Tartaria's currency left a hole in the heart of the 19th century that has been filled with 1,000 lies. We are told we are the pinnacle of human achievement, the most advanced version of the species to ever walk the earth, but the copper griffin in my pocket tells a different story. It speaks of a world that was more connected, more elegant, and more free than the one we currently inhabit. It is a somber realization. We are not the winners of history. We are the survivors of a planetary scale liquidation. The unresolved philosophical loop remains. If the world could be stolen once, how do we know it hasn't been stolen a dozen times before? And who is holding the keys to the vault now? The transition from the physical to the metaphysical erasure began with the restructuring of the great libraries between 1850 and 1860. It was not enough to melt the coinage. They had to burn the maps that gave the coinage a home. In the Imperial Archives of St. Petersburg, there exists a series of correctional gazettes that were issued to cartographers across the continent. These documents were not suggestions, they were mandates, Every reference to a unified Tartarian administrative zone was to be replaced with ethnographic descriptors that implied a vacuum of power. Where there were once sprawling networks of irrigation and logistics, the new maps showed wastes and steppes, not a discovery, not a correction, an eviction of a civilization from the spatial memory of the species. Ask yourself why the most detailed maps of the 18th century, produced by the most rigorous surveyors of the French and British navies, suddenly became unreliable in the eyes of the mid-19th century academies. What if the reliability wasn't the issue, but the reality they depicted? Look at the load distribution of the global telegraph system, which was laid with a speed and precision that defies the official narrative of 19th century labour. We are told it was a brand new invention, a triumph of the copper wire pioneers, but the cables frequently followed the exact ley lines and subterranean corridors that had been used for the old world's acoustic communication networks. They didn't build a new nervous system for the planet. They hijacked an existing one. The invalidation of the currency provided the capital for this takeover. By seizing the electrum and high-purity gold of the Griffin, the new institutional gatekeepers funded the installation of a monitoring web that would ensure no such independent power could ever rise again. The telegraph was the first digital fence. It allowed the central banks to coordinate the suppression of invalid markets in real time. It turned the globe into a synchronized clock, ticking to the rhythm of debt. The architectural record in the American West provides a chilling contrast of scale. In cities like Salt Lake, San Francisco, and Denver, we find pioneer photographs from the 1860s showing massive multi-story stone edifices with sophisticated heating and ventilation systems surrounded by muddy, unpaved streets and people living in wooden shacks. Not a logical progression, not a coherent development, a visual dissonance that suggests a scavenger culture living in the bones of a giant. The people in the shacks did not build the stone palaces. They were the clean-up crew. They were tasked with scraping the griffin motifs off the pediments and replacing them with eagles, lions, and Masonic squares. This was the rebranding of a continent. To make the theft legal, they had to make the previous owners invisible. The currency was the first thing to go, followed by the names, followed by the very memory of the heights from which the world had fallen. Consider the rhythmic sentence of the Great Depression of 1873, which is often glossed over in standard economic histories. It was a global contraction that occurred precisely as the last of the Tartarian gold reserves were being fully integrated into the vaults of the City of London and the Federal Reserve's predecessors. It was the final squeeze. By artificially collapsing the value of silver and other secondary metals, the gatekeepers forced the remaining independent territories to surrender their physical assets for pennies on the dollar. It was the ultimate consolidation, not a failure of the market, not a cycle of capitalism, a planned demolition of the old world's middle class. Those who held the invalid currency were left with nothing, while those who issued the new notes became the masters of the earth. The somber reality is that our current concept of wealth is merely a permission slip granted by the victors of 1844. Institutional gatekeeping extends into the biological realm through the Museum of Natural History trope. By categorizing the artifacts of the previous era as natural wonders or prehistoric anomalies, the establishment removes them from the timeline of human engineering. I found a report from an 1882 excavation in the Ohio River Valley where a cache of griffin stamp plates was found alongside giant skeletal remains. The Smithsonian Institution arrived within 48 hours, cordoned off the site, and the artifacts were never seen again. The official report claimed They were misidentified geological formations. Ask yourself, since when does geology strike coins? Since when does nature organize itself into load-bearing arches and star-fort foundations? The erasure is total. It spans from the dirt beneath our feet to the stars we are taught to navigate by. What if the great year of the ancients was not a myth, but a calendar for these periodic liquidations? The language of the New World was designed to be staccato, efficient, and devoid of the harmonic depth required to understand the old science. We see this in the shift from the classical liberal arts to the Prussian model of education. Students were no longer taught how to think. They were taught how to process. They were prepared for a life of service to the institutions that held the debt. The very idea of an invalid currency was used as a moral lesson. That which is not recognized by the state is not real. It was a psychological branding that lasted for generations. We became a species of amnesiacs, terrified of being outside the valid system. Not this knowledge, not that wisdom, something else, a manufactured dependency on a fraudulent authority. The tension of this realization is what drives the modern investigator into the shadows of the urban exploration narrative. We are looking for the dead nodes where the old reality still leaks through. I stood in the center of an abandoned star fort in the Netherlands, tracing the geometry of the bastions with a surveyor's laser. The precision was within a fraction of a millimeter over a distance of 300 meters. This is not the work of shovels and ox carts. This is the work of a civilization that understood the relationship between shape, frequency, and the Earth's magnetic field. The currency of this civilization, those invalid coins, were likely part of this energetic grid. They were not just tokens of value, they were components. By removing them from circulation, the new powers literally unplugged the world. They turned a functioning energetic machine into a series of historical monuments that we now gawk at without understanding. The skepticism of authority is not a choice. It is a prerequisite for seeing the world as it actually is, a scavenged wreck. The erasure troop is most evident in the great fires that seem to target specifically the municipal archives of the 1870s and 80s. In city after city, the records of land titles, original surveys, and pre-1844 banking ledgers were incinerated. It was a global reset button. When the smoke cleared, the new registries were the only source of truth. If your family had held land under the Tartarian seal, your deed was now ash. If your wealth was in the griffin coin, it was now slag. The institutional gatekeepers used the fires to rewrite the social contract in their own image. They created a blank slate on which they could draw their new world order. We are told these fires were accidents of wood and coal urbanism. What if they were the tactical strikes of a silent war? A war where the primary weapon was the thermal destruction of memory. Rhetorical questioning is the only tool left when the primary evidence has been systematically destroyed. Ask yourself, why does every Renaissance or Enlightenment seem to follow a period of massive, unexplained population decline? Why are the Dark Ages always and conveniently placed before a period of massive architectural revival? What if the revival is just the moving in day? The 1844 invalidation was the final act of a play that had been running for centuries. It was the moment the actors stopped pretending and simply took over the theatre. The currency was the key to the theatre doors. By declaring it invalid, they locked the public out of their own history. We are now, the audience, watching a fictionalized version of our own past played out on a stage built from the recycled materials of our true heritage. The unresolved philosophical open loop is this: if a civilization can be deleted by changing the value of its money and the names on its maps, how do we know who we are? We are defined by the institutions that erased our predecessors. Our validity is contingent upon our participation in the very system that liquidated the griffin. To investigate Tartaria is not to look for a lost kingdom, it is to look for our own lost agency. We are the invalid currency of a future that has yet to be declared. As the digital curtains close around us, the staccato rhythm of the investigative essayist becomes a heartbeat, a reminder that something remains beneath the pavement, not this lie, not that illusion, something else. The truth is not hidden, it is just waiting for someone to stop believing the labels on the vault doors. The transition from tangible erasure to the management of human perception required a new kind of architecture, not of stone, but of time. After the 1844 invalidation, the very way we measure our progress was recalibrated. We are taught to view the mid-19th century as a period of great accelerations, but if you look at the low distribution of historical events, the timeline is suspiciously crowded. It is a dense thicket of inventions, treaties, and wars that seem to occur with a rhythmic frequency designed to overwhelm the observer. This is institutional gatekeeping through information saturation. By filling the void left by Tartaria with a frantic, noisy history, the gatekeepers ensured that no one would notice the silence beneath. Ask yourself why the Victorian era is characterized by such an obsession with order, classification, and the pinning down of every biological and historical specimen. It was a global inventory of stolen goods. They were cataloguing the wreckage before the public realized the ship had been scuttled. Consider the great trigonometrical survey and the mapping of the American interior. We are told these were heroic feats of endurance by men with chains and theodolites, but look at the precision of the coordinates they recorded for the ancient mounds and abandoned ruins they encountered. These sites were not random clusters of earth. They were the geodetic markers of the Tartarian currency network. The electrum coins were the physical nodes that tied the commerce of the land to the mathematics of the heavens. When the currency was invalidated, the surveyors were sent in to decouple the land from its celestial alignment. They renamed the peaks, redirected the rivers, and built their new forts on the exact intersections of the old energy grid. Not a mapping of the unknown, a forensic audit of a conquered estate. What if the Wild West was actually a series of military campaigns to clear the last urban holdouts of a civilization that refused to surrender its griffin gold? The emotional tone of the era's photography is one of haunting emptiness. Look at the early daguerreotypes of Moscow, Paris, and Washington, D.C. The streets are wide, the buildings are grand, and the plazas are utterly vacant. We are told this is a limitation of long exposure times that blurred moving people into invisibility. Ask yourself, in a bustling 19th century capital, would there not be a single stationary horse, a single stopped carriage, a single person sitting on a bench? Not this technical excuse, not that artistic choice, something else. The cities were empty because they had been purged. The population that used the invalid currency had been displaced or liquidated before the new settlers were moved in. The photographs capture the world in a state of transit, a ghost civilization being prepared for its new inhabitants. The tense, unsettling stillness of those images is the visual frequency of a crime scene. Institutional erasure is most effective when it targets the physical senses. I found a series of metallurgical reports from the 1870s regarding the standardization of the mint. The government wasn't just concerned with the weight of the coins, they were obsessed with their sonic profile. They wanted a currency that sounded bass. The high purity Tartarian alloys had a crystalline ring when dropped on a counter, a sound that resonated with the frequency of the human nervous system. The new coins, debased with lead, nickel, and cheap copper, produced a dull, thudding sound. It was a literal grounding of the human spirit. By changing the sound of money, they changed the vibe of the marketplace. They replaced the music of the spheres with the noise of the factory. The skepticism of the modern investigator is essentially a search for that lost resonance, a desire to hear the world ring true once again. The erasure trope is perfectly encapsulated in the orphan trains that ran across North America between 1854 and 1929. Hundreds of thousands of children were moved from the coastal cities to the interior, their records lost, their parents unknown. Where did these children come from? Why was there such a massive, unexplained surplus of orphans precisely when the old world was being finalised for burial? They were the re-education generation. They were the blank slates used to populate the newly discovered lands. They were told they were the children of immigrants and paupers, but their DNA often points to a long-standing presence on the continent. They were the heirs of the griffin, stripped of their inheritance and turned into the labour force for the people who stole it. The 1844 invalidation didn't just target coins, it targeted lineages. The rhythmic sentence of our modern existence is defined by the 9 to 5 and the interest rate. These are not natural laws, they are the shackles of the post-1844 reality. In the Tartarian system, if we are to believe the fragmented ledgers found in the Invalid archives, wealth was not a measure of debt, but a measure of contribution to the harmonic maintenance of the state. The coins were charged with the value of the infrastructure they supported. When you held a griffin coin, you held a share of the star forts, the irrigation canals, and the atmospheric energy collectors. You were a stakeholder in the planet. The new system turned you into a tenant. You no longer own the world. You rent a small portion of it from the banks that hold the valid gold. This is the somber truth of the great erasure. We were downgraded from citizens of a global masterpiece to consumers in a planetary warehouse. Look at the contrast of scale in our national parks. These are often the sites of the most significant Tartarian ruins, massive stone complexes, and geometric earthworks that defy the natural label. By designating them as wilderness, the gatekeepers ensure that no one can perform a private archaeological survey or question the geological origin of the cliffs and valleys. They are protected from us. It is a sophisticated form of hiding in plain sight. We are invited to investigate the beauty of the landscape while being legally prohibited from investigating its history. The 1844 decree is enforced by park rangers and fence lines. The forbidden knowledge is not buried in a secret vault. It is the mountain you are standing on. What if the Grand Canyon is not the result of a river, but the result of a massive ancient mining operation for the very metals that once backed the griffin? The investigative essayist must become an urban explorer of the mind. We must climb over the barriers of our own education. I spoke with a structural engineer who specialises in the renovation of old government buildings. He told me that beneath the brick and mortar of every pre-1900 post office, there is a layer of conducting charcoal and mercury-infused copper wiring that serves no modern electrical purpose. These buildings were part of a global wireless power grid, the same grid that gave the Tartarian coins their energetic charge. When the currency was invalidated, the grid was dismantled, the wires were cut, the mercury was drained, and the buildings were converted to burn coal and gas. It was a technological regression masquerading as progress. We were given light bulbs and told they were a miracle, while the sun-like radiance of the old world was extinguished. Rhetorical questioning is the only way to pierce the veil of the academic consensus. Ask yourself, why did the world's fairs always feature the great organ or massive bell towers? Why was the architecture so heavily focused on acoustics? Because the old world was built on sound. The currency was the tuning fork for the economy. When they invalidated the money, they detuned the civilization. We are now living in the dissonant aftermath. The tense, mysterious atmosphere of our current age is the result of a world that is out of sync with its own foundations. We feel that something is wrong because our biology remembers the resonance of the griffin, even if our history books do not. The somber investigator doesn't just find evidence, they feel the absence of the harmony. This brings us to the 10th and final part of this initial investigation. The unresolved philosophical open loop is the nature of validity itself. Who has the right to declare a truth invalid? We have ceded that power to the institutions that benefit from our ignorance. The 1844 invalidation was a test of human compliance. It proved that if you control the money and the maps, you can change reality itself. We are still living in that experiment. The script is not over. It is merely waiting for the next reset, the next moment when our current valid world is declared a myth to make way for the next iteration of control. The griffin is still there, buried in the mortar, waiting for a generation that is skeptical enough to dig it out. Are you ready to see what else is buried beneath the floorboards? The second decade of the Great Erasure began not with a bang, but with a rhythmic, administrative grinding. By 1854, the initial panic of the currency invalidation had transitioned into a permanent state of institutional gatekeeping. It was the year of the General Reclassification Acts, a series of legal manoeuvres across the Western world that redefined the very nature of an antique. Anything bearing the griffin, anything struck with the resonance-grade electrum of the old world was legally reclassified as contraband of historical significance. This was the birth of the modern museum as a prison for stolen truth. Ask yourself why the mid-19th century saw such a frantic rush to build natural history wings in every major city, not to educate, not to preserve, to sequester. They took the physical evidence of a global high-energy civilization and placed it behind glass, stripping it of its context and labeling it mythic or anomalous. The somber investigator sees through the glass. They see the bars of a cage built from the very wealth that was declared invalid. Consider the load distribution of the new national debts that began to skyrocket precisely as the Tartarian bullion vanished into the private vaults of the new banking dynasties. We are told this was the cost of modernization, the price of the steam engine and the railroad. But what if the money was being used to pay for the silence of the old world's elite? In the private correspondence of the Baring and Hope families, there are references to liquidating the Eastern legacy, a euphemism for buying out the remaining governors of the Tartarian provinces. Those who surrendered their griffin coins for the new debt-based notes were given titles and seats in the new parliaments. Those who refused were erased. Not a revolution of the people, not a triumph of the middle class, a leveraged buyout of the planet. The skepticism of the era is palpable in the literature of the time, where authors like Poe and Dickens wrote of shadowy houses and insolvent legacies that seem to haunt the edges of the new industrial reality. Look at the staccato growth of the asylum system between 1850 and 1880. These were not hospitals, they were holding cells for the unreconstructed. If you remembered the world before 1844, if you insisted that the coins in your pocket were still valid, you were diagnosed with delusional nostalgia or social hysteria. The institutional gatekeepers used the medical profession to pathologize memory itself. To hold the old world as real was to be declared insane. This is the ultimate erasure, the internal colonization of the mind. They didn't just take the money, they took the sanity of anyone who dared to miss it. Imagine the tension of living in a city where the grand stone arches speak of a glorious resonant past, while the doctors tell you they are merely decorative follies built by your primitive ancestors. Not this truth, not that fact, something else, a forced hallucination of progress. The investigative essayist must follow the trail of the re-minted gold. In 1858, a massive influx of unrefined bullion hit the London markets, supposedly from the newly discovered fields in Australia and California. But the metallurgical signatures tell a different story. The purity was too consistent, the trace elements too rare for raw river gold. This was the melted down skeletal remains of the Tartarian treasury. They were washing the griffin's blood off the metal and re-stamping it with the profile of a queen. This new gold funded the expansion of the British Empire, providing the liquidity for the conquest of the very lands that had once been part of the Tartarian network. It was a snake eating its own tail. The world was conquered using its own stolen resources, rebranded as foreign aid and infrastructure investment. What if the Pax Britannica was nothing more than the administrative cleanup of a global robbery? Institutional erasure is most visible in the great surveys of the 1860s, which claimed to discover the ruins of the American Southwest and the interior of Asia. These were not discoveries, they were site inspections. The military expeditions were tasked with identifying which Tartarian structures could be repurposed for the new telegraph and postal networks, and which had to be destroyed. The star forts were a particular priority. These geometric masterpieces, built with a mathematical precision that suggests a deep understanding of telluric currents, were either converted into coastal defences for the new regimes or blown up and used as quarries for the new Renaissance architecture. By breaking the geometry, they broke the energy. They turned a planetary scale battery into a series of disconnected bunkers. The urban exploration narrative is the only way to find the dead nodes where the original power still hums beneath the modern concrete. Ask yourself why the Civil War in America broke out exactly as the new financial system was being finalized. It wasn't just about labor or states' rights. It was about the final resistance to the greenback, the paper currency that had no tie to the old world's resonance. The South and the Western Territories were the last bastions of the hard money tradition, the last places where the Griffin coins still circulated in secret. The war was a sanitization action. It allowed the federal government to implement emergency banking acts that made the possession of non-sanctioned gold a federal offense. The burning of Atlanta, the destruction of the Richmond vaults, these were tactical strikes against the last physical records of the pre-1844 economy. When the war ended, the United States was no longer a republic of sovereign states. It was a corporate entity, fully integrated into the global debt web of the Griffin slayers. The rhythm of the erasure is mirrored in the standardization of time in 1883. Before this, every city had its own local time, tied to the sun and the specific vibration of its own geography. The time zones were an administrative imposition required by the railroads but used to synchronize the global market. They cut the connection between the human body and the local earth. They forced us all to march to the same artificial beat, the beat of the ticker tape machine. This was the final step in making the Tartarian world invisible. If you can't even trust the sun to tell you the time, how can you trust your eyes to tell you the history of the buildings you walk past? The somber reality is that we are living in a synced reality, a digital simulation of a world that was once analog and organic. I found a document in a private collection in Ghent, a manual for the disposal of invalidated assets, dated 1862. It detailed the process for dissolving the social structures of the Northern Federation, another code name for the Tartarian state. It suggested the strategic displacement of key genealogical lines and the replacement of local folklore with standardized national myths. This was the blueprint for the erasure trope. They didn't just kill the people, they replaced their stories. They took the griffin and turned it into a gargoyle, a monster to be feared rather than a symbol of sovereign protection. They took the high technology of the atmospheric collectors and called them steeples and minarets. They turned the science of the past into the religion of the present, ensuring that any investigation into the miracles would be dismissed as faith rather than physics. The unresolved philosophical open loop of this period is the question of consent. Did the world agree to the 1844 invalidation, or was it imposed through a collective trauma we have since forgotten? The Great Fires, the Orphan Trains, the Standardization Acts, these were the tools of a global gaslighting. We are told we chose this modern world, that we traded the superstition of the past for the reason of the future. But look at the quality of the trade. We gave up a resonant, high-purity global culture for a debased, debt-driven industrial grind. We gave up the griffin for the valid note. Is a truth that requires a global police force to maintain really a truth? Or is it just a very long, very expensive lie? As we move into the 8th part of this narrative, the investigative essayist must ask, what happens when the valid system begins to fail? The gatekeepers of the 19th century knew that their debt-based reality was a bubble. They knew that the ghost gold would eventually run out. This is why they are so obsessed with the digital transition today. They are preparing for the next 1844, the next moment when they declare our current lives invalid, to make way for a new, even more restrictive ledger. The mystery of the Griffin coin is not just about where we came from. It is about where they are taking us. The forbidden knowledge is the realization that the standard is a choice, and that the invalid may be the only thing that is truly real. The tension is rising. The floorboards are creaking. The griffin is waking up. The transition from the physical confiscation of 1844 to the psychological fortification of the late 19th century required a re-engineering of the human city. We are told the City Beautiful movement was an aesthetic awakening, a desire to bring neoclassical order to the industrial suit. Look closer at the load distribution of these monumental projects. In London, Paris, and Chicago, The Beaux-Arts shells were dropped directly over the excavated footprints of much older, much more complex foundations. They didn't build these cities, they clad them. They took the raw, high-energy masonry of the Tartarian era and covered it in plaster, marble, and decorative statuary to give it a Roman or Greek lineage. This is institutional gatekeeping via architectural camouflage. By providing a false origin story for the buildings, they made the true origin unthinkable. Ask yourself why the most modern cities of the 1890s look more like ancient Rome than the crude wooden settlements of the 1840s. It is a reversal of time, a regression masquerading as a revival. Consider the great sewerage projects of the 1870s. We are told these were triumphs of public health, the first time humanity conquered the cholera of the slums. But the urban exploration narrative reveals a different reality. The massive brick-lined tunnels were already there. They were the transit veins of the old world, part of a global hydrologic and energetic system that utilized the movement of water to generate frequency. The new authorities didn't dig them, they discovered them, cleared out the silt of the Great Erasure, and redirected the waste of the new industrial population into them. They turned the planet's circulatory system into a toilet. Not this progress, not that hygiene. Something else, the ultimate desecration of a high-technology heritage. To use a cathedral for a coal shed is a crime. To use an energy grid for a sewer is a strategy. It ensures that no one will ever want to investigate the tunnels too closely. The smell alone acts as a biological gatekeeper. The rhythmic sentence of the era was the Patent Act. Between 1860 and 1900, the legal definition of invention was narrowed to favour the corporate entity over the individual discoverer. This was the final lock on the Tartarian technology. If you found a way to draw free energy from the atmosphere, as the Griffin coins and the Star Forts once did, you were sued into insolvency, or your work was classified under national security protocols. The war of currents between Tesla and Edison was the public-facing theatre of this suppression. Tesla was trying to restore the resonant wireless world of the Griffin. Edison was the agent of the valid meter, the man who wanted to put a price tag on the sun. The institutional gatekeepers chose the meter. They chose the wire. They chose the debt. The sombre investigator knows that every power line crossing the horizon is a tether holding us back from a reality that was once as free as the air. Look at the contrast of scale in the public libraries and museums built during this period. The entrances are massive, designed to make the human visitor feel small, insignificant, and new. They are the temples of the new narrative. Inside, the books were systematically replaced. The expurgated editions became the standard. Anything that mentioned the unified Tartarian state, the global electrum standard, or the great invalidation was moved to the special collections, a euphemism for the memory hole. I spoke with a retired archivist in Vienna who claimed that in the 1920s there was a final coordinated effort to repulp any map printed before 1844 that hadn't been already corrected. They were cleaning the attic of history. The skepticism of authority must extend to the very paper we read. What if the classics were rewritten to remove the presence of a global rival? The erasure trope is most hauntingly seen in the World's Fair photographs of the 1900s. We see the Electric Tower at the Pan American Exposition, a structure of impossible elegance, glowing with a light that didn't seem to come from mere incandescent bulbs. It looked like a solid pillar of radiance. Then, as soon as the fair ended, it was dynamited. They destroyed the most beautiful things they ever built. Ask yourself, if you had solved the problem of global illumination, why would you blow up the solution? Unless the electric tower wasn't an invention, but a recovered Tartarian transmitter that they couldn't allow to remain standing. Unless the fair was a demonstration to the global elite that the old power was now under new management, and that the public would only be allowed to see it for a few months before it was taken away forever. The tense, unsettling feeling of those fairgrounds is the feeling of a world being teased with its own lost potential. Institutional erasure reached its zenith with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This was the final nail in the coffin of the Griffin. The last remnants of hard money were officially decoupled from the public hand and placed into a private central ledger. The currency became a total abstraction, a valid ghost, backed by nothing but the threat of force. The 1844 invalidation had reached its logical conclusion. The world was now fully captured. The names of the old provinces were gone, the maps were rewritten, the children were re-educated, and the money was a lie. The staccato rhythm of the ticker tape was the only heartbeat left. We are living in the after time, a period of history that isn't supposed to exist. We are the survivors of a world that was declared invalid by a committee of bankers and mapmakers. I found a Griffin coin once more, this time in a private vault in a city that officially doesn't have any buildings older than 1920. I didn't find it in the dirt. I found it in the collection of a man whose family has sat on the boards of 3 central banks. He didn't see it as an out-of-place artifact. He saw it as a founder's share. This is the somber truth of the investigative essayist's journey. The knowledge isn't hidden from everyone. It is just hidden from you. The gatekeepers still trade in the old truth. They still use the old maps. They still understand the resonance of the stone and the frequency of the metal. They just tell us that it's all fringe theory and internet myth. The forbidden knowledge is the realization that the standard is a prison and the invalid is the keys. The unresolved philosophical open loop of this investigative documentary is the question of the next reset. If the 1844 invalidation was the foundation of our current world, what will be the foundation of the next one? As we move toward a world of programmable digital currency and augmented history, the physical evidence of the Griffin is being erased for the final time. The stones are being ground into gravel, and the old books are being digitized and corrected by AI. We are losing the ability to even stumble upon the truth. The urban explorer of the future will find nothing but seamless plastic and valid code. The tension is at its breaking point. We are the last generation with the capacity to remember that something else was here, not this digital cage, not that social credit, something else, something resonant. Ask yourself one last time, why is the Griffin the guardian of the treasure? Because the treasure is not the gold. The treasure is the sovereignty that the gold represents. The 1844 invalidation didn't steal our money. It stole our right to be a global civilization that isn't dependent on a central ledger. It stole our connection to the Earth's energy and our own history. We are left with the somber task of being the invalid witnesses. We are the coins that refuse to be melted down. We are the load-bearing walls of a history that the architects are trying to demolish. The investigation does not end here. It begins every time you look at a historic building and ask, who actually built this and what did they use for money? The script is a pattern. The pattern is a map. The map leads to a vault that has been empty for 180 years. but the resonance remains. You can feel it in the staccato rhythm of the city, in the tense silence of the archives, and in the invalid ring of a copper coin on a stone floor. The great erasure is a success only as long as you believe the labels. Once you stop believing, the griffin returns, not as a myth, not as a monster, but as a reminder of what the world looks like when it isn't for sale. This concludes the 10th part of the investigation. The rest is buried in the silence of the next part of the cycle.